to that in about 6 weeks to find out where all of her history comes from. I know exactly where all mine comes from. It's all Philippines right there, Southeast Asia. But one day I might like to look at it. So what I did was actually it was a little genetic thing that you can do on Facebook. And I don't know if some of you've seen that, but they take your face and they do this little algorithm and they scan your face and find out what kind of genetic history that you have. And so I put my face into this algorithm and it came out. It was pretty interesting, but I'm Northern Irish. 62%. Yeah, so they're always after me, lucky charms, I tell you. So, I mean, it's the red hair and the freckles that gave it away. Right there. So, my kids are half Swedish and half Irish. So, I actually went online, I was looking for a t-shirt and it says Irish American. So I'm going to get it and I'll wear it. So, but thank you, Facebook, for settling things all these years. In the world. So, what happens is that, our kids share our genetic history. What we're like, that's often passed on to the next generation. That's what we're going to talk about here. The next generation, what is passed on? And oftentimes, we try to pass on our genes, our looks, and our personalities oftentimes, but oftentimes we can set aside a part of our spiritual heritage, and that's what's most important, is what we pass on to the next generation. And we're going to take a look at a case in point in chapter 4 of some of the events that occurred after the fall of Cain, and how that would set a precedent for the future. And last time that we looked at the character and the person of Cain is that we noticed that he was banished after his sin, after his jealousy. He murdered his brother Abel. He was banished, he was branded, he was burdened with fear, and so he was taken out of this early home, and then he was sent out into the wilderness where he would have to scrape a living by himself. So 3 different judgments that were placed upon Cain. He was banished, branded, burdened with fear. But let's see what happens to Cain after this time. So verse 17 is where we're at. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. Well, let's back up to verse 16 to get a little bit of context. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence, lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. So right here at the very beginning, we have a major question. So mom and dad, Adam and Eve, they would have 3 different sons, Cain, Abel, and then eventually Seth, which we'll find out in just a little bit. But you have Cain and Abel. Abel's gone. Cain is left behind. 3 people that are mentioned right there, 3 sons. So the big question at this point is, who was Cain's wife? Who was Cain's wife? Okay, the simple answer is that Cain married his sister or another close relation like a niece. This answer may sound revolting, but if we start from Scripture, the answer is clear. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45 tells us that Adam was the first man. Genesis 3:20 states that Eve was the mother of all the living. And Genesis 5:4 reveals that Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, besides Cain, besides Abel, and Seth. Okay, so there were other living relatives. So it could have been a sister or another close relation like a niece. There were no other people on earth, as some have claimed, and God did not create other people groups from which Cain chose a wife, as we are all made of one blood. Acts chapter 17, verse 26. Big question here is, doesn't the Bible forbid marriage between close relations? It does, but the laws marrying family members were initially given as part of the Mosaic covenant. That's approximately 2,500 years after God created Adam and Eve. Due in part to genetic mistakes, these laws were necessary to help protect offspring from mutations shared by both parents. So right at the very beginning, it was a good, pure genetic code, but then as you progress on, you start seeing mutations happening. In today's world, this would be incest. But originally, there would have been no problem with it. Looking back through history, the closer we get to Adam and Eve, the fewer genetic mistakes there were. So it would have been safer for close relatives to marry and have children. Close relatives of ours have similar genetic defects. But the further we get from Genesis and the closer the inbred genetics, the result is deformity, like pedigree animals, or the health problems of European royal families in the late 19th and 20th century. So you have examples of, you have all these pedigree animals that get breathing problems and circulatory problems. When you start being very selective in the breeding, you start seeing the genetic difficulties occur. Same things happen with the royal families. They were complaining that they were starting getting big lips or something, just deformed jaws at the end of, they were just inbreeding amongst themselves there. And so that was what happened with the close breeding of and genetics here. In actuality, we all have to marry relatives. Okay? Everyone is a distant cousin of yours. Put it all back together, we're like 300 times removed or whatever what it is that they make. We all have connections. Here in eastern Montana, we got a lot of connections. We're all connected. Okay. You go down to, I remember we going down to Denver, flying out to Denver, and then it was like, oh, hey, here's these people we didn't know from Adam. And they're like, oh, hey, you're from eastern Montana? And you're just like, wow, everybody knows everybody here, and everybody's related to one another. And that's a literal thing. Christians who have a problem with this answer of Cain marrying a sister or niece need to remember that Noah's grandchildren must have married brothers, sisters, or first cousins. There were no other people. Abraham married his half-sister. Isaac married Rebekah, the daughter of his cousin Bethuel. And Jacob married his cousins Leah and Rachel. Clearly, the Bible does not forbid the marriage of close relatives until the time of Moses. So, straightforward answer. It's always one of the biggest questions that you have at this point when you reach verse 17 of Genesis chapter 4. So, clear as mud? All right, we're moving on. What we see happening is that Cain builds a city. Okay, Cain builds a city. Look right there in verse 17 says, Cain then building a city, he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methushael, and Methushael was the father of Lamech. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. So the first thing is that we see right here there was a first attempt at urbanization. You have Cain building a city. And this urbanization, what you're going to see happening from this point on, you're going to see a separation. You're going to see a reliance on the resources of man rather than on the resources of God. This is kind of a little transition in the mindset of humanity at this point. It would ultimately, this would lead to rebellion against God, and this would lead to the pre-flood world, where we're going to discover that here in a couple of weeks. You have Lamech come along and his descendants, and you see something happening. It says here Lamech married two women. One was named Ada, and the other Zillah. Okay? So you have the beginning of what we would call bigamy. Two wives. You have monogamy, meaning one wife. Here you have the beginning of bigamy. And here we have you have Cain, and then you have the great-great-great-grandson of Cain. He decides to take 2 wives. What was originally intended to be an equal partnership of man and woman is not possible if you have 2 co-wives. Okay, and with no such thing as legal marriage here in the time of Genesis, this is not so much talking about bigamy as it is talking about promiscuity. Okay, so you have the beginning of bigamy, you also have the birth of industry. Look right here in these verses, it says, Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. Verse 21, his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play the harp and the flute. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron, and Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Now, so along with this urbanization, you have an early industrial revolution. Battery just popped out. Okay, so we have urbanization. You have the beginnings of some instruments being played. You have the 3 sons of Lamech start 3 important activities. You have the husbandry of livestock. You have instrumental music and ironwork. No?
Yes.
Yeah. It's looking red. Is that?
We took some out of Nathan's, maybe that's what you put in.
Okay. No problem. Interesting. I don't know why it's red. Let's go with this.
Yep, we hear you. Wait, you're on.
Okay. Well, we'll do both, just in case, okay? All right, so right here it's mentioned that there's the beginnings of ironwork. And I want us to notice right here, verse 22, you have Tubal-Cain, forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. You don't have a bronze age, you don't have an iron age, it's all metalwork that is being used right here. It's interesting that you see the beginnings of ironwork here. You see the beginnings of the ability of man to take things out of the earth and craft them into useful tools. The birth of industry. You see, thirdly, the brazenness of iniquity. Look at what happens here, verse 22. Lamech said to his wives, Ada, Zillah, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. So what you see right happening here, you have the great-great-great-grandson of Cain come along, and he's murdered a guy, and he treats what was meant to be a punishment for Cain as a challenge for himself. He's proud of the fact that he has killed someone, and so all of a sudden life becomes cheap to him. So you have the brazenness of iniquity. This is kind of reflective of what we see happening today. You take, for example, in Iceland. You guys hear that story of Iceland? What happened is that they're saying that all of our we're not getting any mentally handicapped children anymore. And that sounds like a great thing, but actually what they're doing is that they find out that if they have Down syndrome in the womb, they're just aborting them all. And now they're saying, oh, look at this, we don't have any recurrence of Down syndrome. So now they're just taking them all out. It's the brazenness of iniquity. There's a boldness to it. It's like, oh, I don't care anymore. That's what happens as you start seeing this pattern of behavior. You see, beginning with Cain, passed on to the next generation, and on until they're like, no, look at this, I'm proud of what I'm doing here. So you see the beginnings of bigamy, you see the birth of industry, you see the brazenness of iniquity. And you see from this point on, just a slow downward degradation of the character of man. But in the middle of it, you see something awesome. There's a beacon of hope. There's a beacon of hope happening here. Look at verse 25. Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. And Seth also had a son. He named him Enosh. And at that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. So it was clear that Seth, in his birth, that he was beginning a new age of man. There were other sons and daughters born to Adam and Eve, born perhaps before or after Seth, but there was a prophetic outburst from Eve at this point. She says that God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. So God provided a little prophetic foresight to Eve to know that this one, out of all of her sons, was the one through whom God would one day keep his promise to redeem mankind. That name Seth means anointed or compensation. He would bring about the fulfillment of a promised Messiah. And so she had this understanding, okay, God is going to fulfill his promises through this son. And so for this reason, among Seth and his descendants, we start seeing a true worship of God. And it says at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And so, yes, men and women were going deeper and deeper into sin, but even in the midst of such darkness, God has his own people who worship him, and they were turning their hearts towards him. There was still a remnant there. So some good things came from the union of Adam and Eve's descendants, others not so much. And you're going to see this conflict of the generations as we go on. From the beginnings of humanity, you begin to see the separation of two distinct mindsets. Those that are for God and those who are in rebellion against him. There are two sides. There's always been two sides. Even up to this day, there's still two sides. And back in 1874, and we talked about this before, Richard L. Dugdale was employed by the New York Prison Commission to visit the state prisons, and there was one guy by the name of Max Jukes, and as this one individual was researching the history of Max Jukes, they found out that his descendants, interestingly, 310 of the 1,200 were professional paupers, 1/4. 300 died in infancy from lack of care. 50 women lived lives of notorious debauchery. 400 men and women were physically wrecked by their own wickedness. 7 were murderers. 60 were habitual thieves who spent on the average 12 years each in lawlessness, and 130 convicted criminals. This is one guy. This one guy, that's all his descendants. Because he set that precedent, you see how many people were affected by his behavior. But then you take one other guy, Jonathan Edwards, in 1703. His descendants, one was a U.S. vice president, 3 U.S. senators, 3 governors, 3 mayors, 13 college presidents, 30 judges, 65 professors, 80 public office holders, 100 lawyers, and 100 missionaries, pastors, and theologians. One guy. That's all it takes. One person setting a precedent, and you spread that example to the next. You see what happens with Cain? In the next few chapters, what we're going to find out, you start with Cain, and then you see all of his descendants to come to such a point where God says, I regret even making man. They were so evil and wicked, God says, my heart pains me for making them. Lifeway Research study has found that while the majority or 2/3 of Americans today admit that they're sinners, only a minority, or 28%, said that they depend on Jesus Christ to overcome sin. You see there a little precedent here? Okay, more people rely on themselves than on Jesus to overcome sin. 34% said that they are sinners who work on being less of one, the study found, while 10% insists that sin does not exist. Another 8% argue that they're not sinners, while 5% said they are fine with being a sinner. You see the brazenness of iniquity happening in our society? It's like we just don't care anymore. Scripture says, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. You can say that they're moral without the Maker. That they're doing the right thing, but they don't have God in the picture. That's the tone of our times today. You just do what is right, and just start mentioning God. No. None of that. Well, what are you seeing happening in other countries where there is rampant persecution in dark nations? You take, for example, the nation of Iran. One of the top persecutors of the church today. They are doing a fantastic, amazing job, and the church in Iran is growing by leaps and by bounds. You would think, man, that's a Muslim nation. It's like, how can it be growing? It's because they're not dependent upon themselves. There's not that self-sufficiency. What you see happening with Cain at the beginning right here, he starts building his own city. He starts being dependent on his own things and upon the people around him, and then there's that slow sway away from dependence on God. That's what happens with us today, is that we become so dependent on the things of this world that we just kind of desensitize. I don't need God to help me. No. I don't need to pray, give us this day our daily bread when I can provide it for myself. So there's a dependence upon man, upon his ways, and then when that happens, you start getting away from the heart of God. But what you're seeing happening in nations like Iran and China, they're getting back to the heart of God because they realize that there's nothing else. And we realize that God is enough. That's when you start saying, hey, I got everything that I need. What is their need for today is that same thing that Jonathan Edwards did with his kids. It's going back to that core of what God told us to do 2,000 years ago, is to go into all the world and make disciples. Make disciples. Max Jukes came along, he made a disciple of his children. Wound up making the United States spend over $150 million of its money just for incarceration for his children. If we are going to change this world, it's going to begin with one person taking another person and saying, let me tell you about Jesus. There's a call for discipleship. A call for just reproducing the things of God in our hearts to those, just one other person. What we're going to be doing here in our church over the next year, and this is going to be a grand experiment, is can we do church like Jesus said church church should be. Just simply making disciples. We're going to have this opportunity, and we're going to be talking over this for the next week or so. But can we do church just simply making disciples? And let me tell you, there's a need for it. I'm going to go back to this one video clip. This is from Francis Chan. But he talks about the changing culture and what happens when people get away from just simply making disciples. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this. Okay? So let's take a look.
Sure. Because, here's the thing. And I'm not trying to be prophetic right now. I'm just using my logic. And I'm going, I think the way the world is going, the way the U.S. is going, I think there's going to come a time, and it's probably sooner than later, when what I do in a public forum is going to be labeled as a hate crime. That a lot of things that we teach will be labeled as hate speech. And will these public forums even be able to take place? And as we get closer to that, and there becomes this little war of whether we can do it or not, we'll be so consumed with winning this war that we'll forget about preparing for the future. And again, let me just throw a couple examples out at you. And I'm not saying this is where the U.S. is going. Understand me. I just want to throw a thought out at you. And again, it's from history, which I'm terrible at history. But this I do know because I read it in a book. We have these communist revolutions in China and in Russia. In both revolutions, they were trying to kill the church, right? I mean, the whole point is we're gonna destroy the church. And now in Russia, everything was built around cathedrals and these priests. Everything was centered around these buildings and these teachers. The moment the government took away these teachers and the church assets, the people didn't know where to turn. They didn't know how to grow. They didn't know how to disciple. And so the church basically died. In China, same thing happened. And under Mao Zedong, they tried to, they got rid of all the buildings. But there was something different about the church in China. See, before all that happened, they had empowered the ordinary Christians. And the ordinary Christians knew how to lead others to the Lord. The everyday church attender knew how to teach others how to grow in their faith. So when they took away the leaders and they took away the church buildings, the church was fine. The people were fine. In fact, under Mao Zedong, the church, the persecuted church, grew from 2 million to an estimated about 80 million in these underground gatherings. Why? Because the people, they understood how to minister to other people. They knew how to teach other people. And I just want you to look at your life and go, okay, which camp would I fall into? Would I be one of those that's just lost? Like, wow, what do we do now? The building's gone? The leadership's gone? Or do you just go, we don't really need a building. And I know the Word of God. And I know how to lead other people. And when I look at what God's doing with people craving this type of leadership and this type of movement, I go, it could be the Lord preparing us for the future. And it's pretty exciting to be a part of that. And I hope you get excited about that. And I hope you go, okay, what would it look like for me? And am I this leader? Am I making a disciple? Because regardless, biblically, that's what we're called to do.
There's going to be a day where I'm going to be up here and what I say from here will be labeled as hate speech. That marriage is between one man and one woman. That maybe we should pray for our nation, pray for our president. If one day I'm arrested, will church still go on? See, the problem is, communist Russia, they took out the leadership, and what you see happening after that, because nobody discipled, the church was virtually gone, just like we were saying. But you take places, everybody operated under the top-down approach. The priest always took care of everything. But what you see happening in China is that it was a bottom-up approach. It was the people of God going out and making disciples. And so when they took out the churches, took out the leadership, is that it actually thrived. Till today, there's more Christians over in China than there are in the United States. There's more Christians in South Korea right now. And they're actually putting out more missionaries than we are today. Because they operated from a bottom-up approach. Rather than, okay, I come to church and this person needs to do this for me, they need to teach, they need to do all this. Instead of going there, they were going out. Which is what Jesus told us to do 2,000 years ago. Go and make disciples. So the question is, can we go back 2,000 years to the way that it was originally formed, that Jesus said, to go and make disciples? We're going to try it. This is going to be a grand experiment, okay? Typically on Sunday mornings, we come here. All right, you go to Sunday school class. This is where you get fed. But I want to see if we can go and find one other person and say, hey, come on over. Let's talk over the things of Christ. Or maybe take a group. Or maybe take another 2 individuals alongside of you and you say, I'm going to teach, I'm going to show, coach, and then I'm going to release you, and we're going to reproduce this amongst one another. So what would happen if I was taken out, our Sunday school teachers were taken out? What would happen to the church? I would hope we could say, we're going to thrive just like China does. Everybody starts at the beginning somewhere. Okay? We're going to give this a try over the next year. Find out how this can work in the body life of our church. We're going to start a little discipleship program. And I'm not saying program as something that we organize that everybody jumps aboard. I'm talking about, all right, are we individually going to take the initiative? And perhaps we can provide an atmosphere where we can have discipleship. Come in here, grab a cup of coffee and a donut or something and say, hey, come on, let's go study the Word together. The way that we're going to operate with our little youth groups is the same exact atmosphere, is that we're going to come along and we're going to be focused on how do you read the Bible, how do you observe, interpret, apply it, and then see how we can go from the very basics and reproduce that into other people's lives. So there's 3 definitions, but the whole process of discipleship is convergent baptism, teaching the way of Jesus as it's used in Matthew 28, 19 through 20. And then we're going to ask ourselves how, where, and how should that happen in our church? And so there's so many different ways we can do this. Okay, and we're going to be talking about this over the next week or so. But there's no one single strategy. Okay, it's not a Sunday school program, and it's not a program that we're going to put out there. It's us taking the initiative to disciple one another. There's a grocery list of possibilities we can do here. Okay, Titus 2:4 says that older women are to train younger women. 2 Timothy, Paul trained Timothy to train others to train others. Fathers are to train their children. So could we provide an atmosphere where a dad can come along and take his son or daughter and say, hey, let's study something together. And it doesn't have to be at the church. It can be at a home. It can be at a coffee shop somewhere. Missionaries are to teach the nations. All Christians are to exhort each other every single day to avoid sin. All Christians are to use their gifts to serve others. Priscilla and Aquila, on the spur of the moment, it seems, explain the way of God more accurately to Apollos. How can we accomplish this work of discipleship? And it doesn't have to be a perfect model. Let's give this a try. And I'm going to ask the question, can we operate like we did originally 2,000 years ago? one day, gathering in a room like this won't be illegal. I believe that it's coming sooner rather than later. But I also believe that if men and women continue the call of Jesus in their lives, as he did back in Matthew chapter 28, if we continue that call, I can imagine the church would grow even greater beyond. And it wouldn't be a numerical thing, but it would be that hidden kind of underground kind of thing. I believe that God can do amazing, miraculous things, such as he's doing in Iran and China, South Korea. It's just one person taking the works of God in their hearts and life and investing it into somebody else. We'll talk more about this, but let me give you one last little example. This is from my brother. He sent it to me, and it's a letter that my mom wrote before she passed away. It says, "Son, I am certainly inspired to give you this Bible, knowing that through his words you will develop a meaningful relationship with God. This book of books will lift your spirits, help you live above life circumstances, and draw you close to the Son of God, Jesus, as you seek to know him better. Here is a book you will want to read and share. I love you, Mom." Mom's been gone for 16 years. But the legacy still lives on, because she took the words of God and let it live in her heart and life. And that's what we're to do for one another. We're going to catch a vision together as a body. Get this book, read it, and share it with those who are around us. And there's no greater thing you can pass on to another person than these precious words. Amen?
Amen.
Let's pray. Lord, we are your church, and we're not a building, we're not a program. We are ecclesia, the called out ones. You've taken us from dark places and sin and hurt and pain, where you've called us into the blessing of your glorious light. Lord, until that time that you come to take us home, Lord, we're going to have trials, we're going to have difficulties, struggles. And Lord, until that time, I pray that your glorious light shine in and through our lives. Lord, I thank you for a mother who would quiz me over the Bible and make me memorize the books of the Bible and scriptures when I really didn't want to. Because I can look back now and say, Lord, those early lessons were so invaluable, and it's made me the person I am today. Lord, thank you for the discipline of love. Would we go and find another person and invest? And we can start, Lord, by just simply going and taking that which you have given us and just pouring it into somebody else's life. Lord, would you lay that, would you put a burden on our heart for that one person? Lord, today there's that one person that we know that they need to know the things of the Lord, but Lord, I pray that you'll give us a burden and a desire to pray for them, and then to go out and step forward and say, hey, would you like to be a part of this amazing relationship with Jesus? And teach them those ways. Lord, if we're going to change this world, it begins one person at a time. And so, Lord, starting today, begin with us, your people. Lord, until that time, until next time that we gather together, Lord, take these truths and just simply saturate our hearts and souls with it. We thank you, dear Lord, for all that we've studied this morning. Lord, until next time that we gather together, bless us, watch over us, be with these brothers and sisters of mine, and shower your love upon them. Lord, all of these things we commend to you in the precious name of Jesus.